I'm going to talk a little bit about inflation because that's something I know something about. On the first slide, I have two books. Everyone's selling something. We're all economists at heart, so I presume that's okay. The two recent books on inflation, one is called The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. The second is called Crisis Cycle, which is a little more accessible about the euro. And the other two pictures are, I have a Substack called The Grumpy Economist, and I do this show called Goodfellas with H.R. McMaster and Neil Ferguson, which I hope you'll enjoy. So end of advertisements, on to substance. Let's talk a little bit about inflation. I'm going to talk primarily about inflation in the US because I'm in the US and that's what I know about. I'll put up a slide at the end of inflation in Israel, and you can tell me why it happened and why it didn't happen. But this will be about the US. I guess when the US sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold, so it's not the end of the world to talk about the US. So what happened? Something amazing just happened in the US starting in 2021. Really after COVID was over, inflation suddenly came out of basically nowhere. The Federal Reserve normally raises interest rates to fight inflation, and the Federal Reserve sat its hands and did nothing for an entire year as inflation surged. Inflation eventually plateaued and then eased. It did not spiral away, even though interest rates, though they had just begun rising, were still substantially below inflation. So the view that interest rates have to be greater than inflation to push inflation down was absolutely not true. So obvious questions. Why did inflation start? Why did it plateau and ease? Why was there no spiral? Why was there no repetition of the early 1980s, no big recession? What happens next, and how can we avoid repeating this unpleasant episode, which I'm afraid we may do soon? Well, here's I have added to the graph here on the right-hand axis, the black line, which is debt, US federal debt. During COVID, the US borrowed and spent about $5 trillion. $3 trillion of that was monetized. The Federal Reserve bought the newly issued debt and issued money and sent checks to people and businesses. I'm not necessarily going to criticize that. I think it was wildly overdone, but the government had to do something. But that's what it did. And let's just not criticize. That's just what happened and see what the effect of that is. Importantly, I think, to my view of inflation, the deficits did not stop after the crisis was over, and we got $6 trillion more debt afterwards. The American Rescue Plan of January 2021, with another $1 trillion thrown down various rat holes, was in many ways a triggering event, and that was after the big COVID stuff was over. I put the book, I'm the luckiest economist on the planet, because March 2021 was exactly when I sent in my draft of Fiscal Theory of the Price Level that I had been working on for 20 years. The first draft said, the introduction said, look, we haven't seen inflation since the Reagan era, but it's something I know something about. So you'll sell 3 copies of this book, but someday you might want to dust it off. It might come in useful. By the way, don't print up $5 trillion and hand it out. You'll get inflation. So thanks. My book sales did well, thanks to the US Treasury. Everybody else suffered. So now how do I think about it? It's called the Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. I call it common sense. Most of the 600 pages is why everything else is wrong. But how should we think about inflation? And particularly in our current economy, things have changed. The theories of inflation you've been taught refer to an institutional structure from the 1930s. You read textbooks, they still today say, oh, well, people go down to the bank to cash a check to get cash once a week. And you go, what? People use credit cards. What are you talking about? Go down to the bank once a week to get cash and cash a check. So how do we think about it? As a fundamental truth in life, which is that the real value of government debt is equal to the present value of primary surpluses. What does that mean? Primary surpluses is when the government takes in more taxes than it spends and therefore soaks up some money. So that's how bondholders get paid back. So the value of what they hold has got to be equal to the back of value of what they get paid back. Just like stock is the present value of dividends. The stock price adjusts so that the value of the shares is the present value of dividends. So too, the price level adjusts so that the value of government debt, including money, is equal to the value of what the government will charge in taxes over spending. One way of thinking of it is inflation is always too much money chasing too few goods. So how much is too much? And what does the government do about it? Well, if there's too much money outstanding, the government can soak it up by charging taxes more than spending. Otherwise, yeah, I think of it just like stock in the government. Now that should be obvious. Yeah, duh. Money is valuable because money and debt are sort of the same thing, and because the government stands behind it and will raise taxes to pay off this debt. And if they won't, then we'll get rid of the debt, and we'll send the only way to get rid of the debt is to try and buy stuff, so we'll send prices up. Now that insight has that guides you, like all good insights, tells you that debt and deficits are not necessarily dangerous. Debt and deficits, in fact, are a wonderful and good thing managed correctly. What matters is debt and deficits versus the long run ability, will, and faith of repayment, not necessarily today. So my top little graph here plots a big debt or deficit followed by periods of small primary surplus to pay off that debt. That doesn't cause any inflation. And the present value, the sum of everything over here on the right-hand side hasn't changed at all. Deficit now, repayment later. That is how governments for 2 centuries have successfully fought wars and crises. There's a period of debt or deficit. When you fight the war, you don't try to charge taxes now to pay for the war now. You borrow now, but then everyone understands the taxes later will pay for it. That's a great thing. Debt and deficits can happen with no inflation at all. The danger is second one, debt or deficits that happen and people don't trust that it's going to get repaid. So that causes inflation. That present value has declined. So this is both your insight from looking at the long run here. We have to look not so much at the debt and deficit, but by faith in, plans in, commitments to institutions that guarantee the repayment of the debt. And that's got to be the crucial thing. Of course, the next danger comes if people just sort of lose faith in the government, even without a deficit, then inflation can sort of come from nowhere. So that's, it seems like perfectly sensible, but, a perfectly sensible principle has now guided how we think about inflation to get away from today and to think about faith in the long run. So let's look back at what happened. This is the same plot as before with debt versus expected repayment. What was different about 2021? Well, in the US for sure, that whole expected repayment stuff had fallen by the wayside. Congress in the US may seem completely dysfunctional to you, but there actually were spending rules that said if you spend more money, like $5 trillion, you need to tell us where it's coming from. And those were suspended. Our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, in January 2021, echoed the zeitgeist of the time. The zeitgeist of the time was, don't worry, government debt doesn't matter. She said, go big, interest costs are low. Modern monetary theory reigned. Stimulus, we just need to borrow money, print it, throw it around, that'll get the economy going. And in the US, in Europe, they did the super bonus where they also borrowed money and threw it out. Nobody was worried about how do we repay debt in 2020. And I think one of the great lessons of inflation is really good for us, sort of in a way that, getting a bad grade in school is good for you. There was this zeitgeist that debt doesn't matter. We can just grow out of it, throw it around. We need stimulus, hysteresis, all that, and so forth. Well, we did what you tried, and we got inflation. So it's not demand, it's supply. And you do it again, you're going to get more inflation. That's a really important lesson for all of our governments to learn. Now, I put up an equation. What am I doing in a dinner speech with an equation? You don't have to read the equation. What I want you to know is there are equations there. I want to advertise what is it that I do as an economist. This is an easy story to tell, but it's also an easy story to make fun of. what we do as economists is try to make the stories a little bit more concrete. And so this is just a little view into what I do as an economist. There's some equations up here, and the equations just express standard views of the economy, including the one I just wrote down. One of the equations in there is that the value of government debt, the price level adjusts, so the value of government debt is the present value of primary surpluses. The other two equations are the standard equations that we use to think about the economy. If you raise interest rates, people will consume a little less, save a little more. Inflation is driven by expected future inflation. Companies, knowing that the prices will go up tomorrow, raise the prices today. So we got to get some, dynamics. That's the kind of stuff we do. So what you're looking at the right is a model simulation. It's just those equations, and you just simulate what happens if the government dumps money on people with no plan to pay it back. And the central bank does nothing, leaves interest rates completely alone. By having equations, all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. It may not be right. Equations do not prove that you're right. But if there are no equations, it's almost certainly wrong. So at least it's an internally consistent view of the world. The central bank does nothing. Inflation will surge. The dashed line is inflation measured year on year, the way we usually measure inflation. There will be a surge of inflation, which then goes away on its own. The level of prices will rise. What are we doing? Inflation is eating away the value of government debt. When you hand out $5 trillion, somebody's got to pay for it. That can be taxpayers. Oh, we're not raising taxes. That can be future taxpayers. Oh, we're not going to raise taxes in the future. Well, who's going to pay for it? The current bondholders. So by inflating away the value of bonds, we essentially default on those bonds, and current bondholders pay for it. And so there is a complete solid view of this. It says even if the central bank does nothing, inflation will come, and then inflation will leave. I've answered two of the puzzles. Where did inflation come from? Why did it go away? At least in an internally consistent way. Now, what about this one-time shock? Well, in fact, the primary surplus or deficit to GDP in the US, here's it is, down is deficit, up is surplus. Neglecting interest costs, which is the way you're supposed to do the accounting, COVID was huge, and the year after COVID was money down rat holes were huger. But now the US is back to sort of regular levels of dysfunction. Now, I don't know why we are, back in the old days, we used to run primary surpluses in good times and then, have deficits in bad times, exactly what we're supposed to do. Now we just always run deficits, and now we're down to, 2, 3, 4, 5% deficits. And the world seems to still want to buy US Treasury bonds. We'll see how long that lasts. But at least we're down to regular levels of dysfunction. So why there was a spurt of inflation that then went away, the price level just went up and stayed there, at least makes sense. Confirming it, this is a graph made by Barrow and Bianchi. I wish I had thought to make the graph. They look across countries and look at how much did the government spend during the COVID and the year afterwards versus how much total inflation did they get. And you can see a strong pattern across countries that countries which spent more got more inflation, and countries that spent less got less inflation. An award for Israel for being on the lowest end of this and getting through COVID well and escaping the subsequent inflation. Now, what about the Fed? The central banks are not helpless. Central banks matter. This is the best I can tell you. I'm not going to give you a bunch of equations. What can central banks do constrained by fiscal policy? And here's my best view of what central banks can do. If they raise interest rates, that lowers inflation temporarily by raising inflation in the long run future. Now, that's a good thing for a central bank to do when it's faced with a shock. If the central bank is faced with this event coming from fiscal policy, well, why don't we, instead of sitting on our hands and just waiting for it to go away, saying transitory, let's raise interest rates, bring down inflation in the short run, and then at the cost of inflation in the longer run, but at least you get a steadier inflation. That's a good thing to do. So bottom line, as I look at the event through this model, this theory, fiscal theory of the price level, we have the surge of inflation. We have it easing and then coming down quickly once the Fed starts raising interest rates. And then at high interest rates, we have kind of stubborn inflation that isn't going away. Well, bingo. Here's theory. Here's what happens if you drop money on people. Here's what happens when the Fed raises interest rates. It brings the inflation down quickly, but then you get a stubborn, persistent inflation in the long run. That seems to make sense to me. And it's very, very simple, straightforward story. Now, I'm sure economics is mostly about recognizing fallacies. So everyone says, well, it's a supply shock. It's a relative demand shock. It's greed. It's, everything else. The dog ate my homework. It wasn't our fault. So what is a supply? These happen. There certainly were supply shocks. A supply shock, though, is a relative price shock. People wanted Pelotons, and there weren't enough Pelotons. The price of Pelotons went up, but relative to other things. People wanted Pelotons. They didn't want to go out to restaurants. So a supply shock means that one price goes up relative to another, but does not tell you why all prices go up together. So number one lesson, if you've been asleep, wake up. Do not confuse prices, and especially relative prices, with inflation, which is the level of all prices. It is, in fact, always demand, always monetary and fiscal policy that determines whether there is inflation or not. So here's a supply shock, which we certainly had. TVs, Pelotons, energy went up, restaurants and wages did not. But the overall price level is the average of overall prices. Overall prices only go up if there is, and stay up if there is extra demand. Overall prices don't have to go up if there's no extra demand. So whether the overall price level goes up is always monetary and fiscal policy. So lesson, first, do not confuse inflation, the rate of growth of prices, with the price level. Been a big brouhaha in the US. The worthies at the New York Times say, inflation is over. Why are all the peasants with pitchforks mad? The peasants with pitchforks are saying everything's 20% more expensive than it used to be. Of course we're mad. Well, that's the price level, not the inflation rate. And don't confuse relative prices, one thing relative to another, with the overall price level. All of this supply shock stuff is suffused with that conceptual mistake. Supply shocks mattered. What was the causal chain? There was a lab leak. We now know where COVID came from. The conspiracy theories were right. It's a lab leak. That caused the supply shock. The supply shock caused the fiscal and monetary policy. That's how our governments respond to shocks. They flood the world with money. They choose to raise the level of overall prices rather than have the price of anything go down. Inflation was a choice. Government now this is why it's not easy. I do not want this tone of, I don't want to have a tone of, oh, it was too easy. Governments met COVID with war finance. They held interest rates down, they inflated to tax the bondholders. That's what the US has done in every war. It was not some nebulous shock that we couldn't control. It was not a technical problem or adjectives in the strategy. And these are hard choices. When you're faced with a crisis or a war or a supply shock or a big tariff, relative prices are going to go apart. The economy is going to hurt, and you're faced with a choice. Do we flood it with money and get inflation and try to ameliorate some of these things, or do we not? So if you don't want it to happen again, you got to prepare to make different choices and not just, oh, it was some shock we couldn't do anything about. Unfortunately, that's the way things work in the US. So as I look at the future, I am worried. This is the US's debt to GDP ratio. It is now higher than it was since anytime since World War II. And of course, this projection from the Congressional Budget Office is optimistic. It's optimistic because the projection, look where the debt came from. Big run up. What happened in 2008? I don't know. What happened in 2020? Debt surges in crises. 2008, there's the deficit in 2020. The debt surges in crises. So this projection says there won't be any crises anymore. There's going to be crises again. So the little black line is my projection of what happens when there's the next crisis. That won't happen. The CBO says it won't happen. The only question is how won't it happen, and who's going to pay for it? So there's two worries. The first worry is with all this debt around, if the Fed has to raise interest rates to fight inflation again, when you raise interest rates, that raises interest costs on the debt. And you can already see what's happening now with Trump versus Powell. It's finally getting clarified. Trump is mad about interest costs on the debt. He's mad about the deficits, and there's now $1 trillion of interest costs on the debt because the Fed has raised interest rates. So if the Fed has to raise interest rates again, each 1% of interest rates is 1% deficit due to interest costs on the debt. Congress and the administration are going to say, no, you don't. And in every economic model we have, in this, not just fiscal theory, if higher monetary policy has to be accompanied by fiscal policy paying the interest cost on the debt. And if it doesn't, the central bank cannot control inflation with interest rates. So there's a worry. If you come to the war and you don't have any ammunition, or you got guns, but the Congress isn't giving you bullets, then you're in big trouble. And where did it go? My second worry is, of course, what happens in the next shock? There will be something happen. What happens if China invades or blockades Taiwan? We have a massive supply shock. The US is going to want to bail out everybody, stimulate everybody, and this time fund some serious military spending. So Uncle Sam says to, global markets, I need $10 trillion. Well, who's going to lend Uncle Sam $10 trillion now, expecting it to be paid back, especially with raw memories from having it been inflated away? So, those are substantial worries. And the answer is, as usual, fix things before the crisis comes. Fix the long-run fiscal problems so that the government can borrow without inflation. Prepare to make better choices. So we really did overdo it in COVID. We threw money around like it was manure. You had to spend money, but spend it a little bit more wisely, and maybe don't meet every supply shock with inflation. Now, this long-run perspective is good and bad news. You do not need sudden austerity. What you need is to reestablish faith that if the government needs to borrow, it will pay it back over 10, 20 years of sober fiscal policy. It's very different from 1 or 2 years of budget deficit gimmicks and so forth. So that's both good and bad news. Fixing the long run is harder. It also means that pro-growth microeconomic policy is really important. If you can just grow the economy 1% more, you get 1% more tax revenue for free without having to raise tax rates. I brought along to close to Argentina. This is the best graphs I could find last night when I was making graphs. Argentina is a great recent example of fiscal theory. What happened in Argentina is, well, first of all, this should warm free marketers everywhere. I'm sort of a free market libertarian, and everyone says, oh, that's not politically feasible. And I wish I had thought to say, well, do you think it's politically feasible that a libertarian whose dogs are named von Mises and Hayek would get elected to president of Argentina and then stay in office to enact all sorts of free market controls? And, that'll never happen. Well, look, it just happened. And in fact, what happened is, here's inflation in Argentina. It was quite out of control and has come down, almost completely gone away. Came down because they cut the budget by 5%, 5% of GDP fiscal consolidation, and he's still in power, and people still like him. With interest rates, now here, they should be on the same graph, the inflation was up to 265, interest rates peaked at 115. We never had high interest rates. This inflation went away when they solved the fiscal problem without high interest rates. So it's just a classic of how solve the fiscal problem, solve the microeconomic problem, start growing, and inflation will go away. This is Israel. So I don't know anything about Israel. And, well, I don't know nearly enough about Israel. And I'm really reluctant to be the kind of American economist who comes to places and tells people how to run their own affairs. So I'll just put up, for interest, I found this last night, what's happened in inflation. You put up inflation in Israel going back to the 1970s. And of course, you have this surge of inflation in the late 1980s with a dramatically successful reform. So, really well done to the government Israel in getting control of inflation. And when you look at it, what was it? Well, got the budget under control. That's number one. Number two, the most important thing was got microeconomic liberalization, so the economy started growing like crazy. There were some price controls in there somewhere and some stuff with the unions, but I view that as kind of adjustment, kind of break the back of the adjustment process, not essential. So the big inflation story in Israel is this tremendous success, which looks like just a classic stabilization, which is not about the central bank. The central bank was part of it, but it was primarily about fixing the fundamentals. Where have we been lately? So here since 2000, and inflation came down. And Israel, as I showed you in the previous graph, had a remarkably subdued by international standards, inflation during and after the pandemic. So well done there. And of course, the challenge since then has been war. And I recommend Amir Yaron gave a great speech at Hoover last year, which is on the Hoover website. If you look up the Monetary Policy Conference on how do you run monetary policy during a war when, among other things, a large fraction of the population leaves their jobs and is off fighting a war. There's a supply shock, which is very successfully managed as far as I can tell. So that's just the facts and not much analysis, but I'm hoping you'll tell me how Israel fits in the grand pattern. So just to close, fiscal, as we rethink inflation, it's not about money supply anymore. I love you, Milton Friedman, but that's just central banks set interest rate targets, so that doesn't really apply anymore. And the foundations of the sort of Keynesian models have been falling apart. This is the main one who makes sense. It's an ancient idea. Where is fundamentally the value of money? Because the government backs it with its tax revenues. And like any good idea, here's the Adam Smith quote. A prince who should enact that a certain proportion of his taxes be paid in paper money might give value to the paper money. That's the basic idea of where inflation comes from. And if you don't have enough tax revenue or cut spending enough, it's going to fall apart. The rest is just advertisements for various writing about it. But I'll leave it there and answer any questions here. Well, I wanted to add one. Where's my last thing? I talk about inflation because that's what I know something about. Inflation is not the most important question. When you do economics or science or anything in life, you got to do what you know and not necessarily the most important question. And there's the old story of the drunk who's looking for his car keys under the light because that's where the light is, even though he left his car keys over by the car. Well, there's some wisdom in that drunk story. I look where the light is. The most important thing for all of our economies is long-run growth. Now, a stable fiscal situation with low inflation is one of the, it's a very important institutional part of long-run growth, but it's a small institutional part. And so here's the GDP per capita. I put up US, Israel, Spain, and Poland. Israel's growing nicely, but it's still in the category with Spain. And look at Poland catching up like crazy, and still about half the level of GDP per capita than the US. Now, a lot better than your neighbors, but Israel should be up here. Israel should be up here. The US is pretty darn dysfunctional. You can do better than that, can't you? And that's, it just comes down to free markets, free people, good institutions, property rights, rule of law, and limited, taxes that don't destroy anything, not too much regulation, and so forth. That's the most important issue. Low inflation, good central banking is part of that good institutional background. But, really, we should be talking about how to get that from, 40,000 up to 80,000. And that's not about stimulus. It's not about central banks. It's not about inflation. It's about the real microeconomic priorities. So that's the talk I should give, and sort of the one I did give when I came to Israel. But I know something about inflation, so we talked about inflation today. Thank you.
So I'm just interested, John, in your sense of where we are now. Let's for the time being, let's forget about Israel. Let's talk about the United States. They just passed this big so-called one big beautiful bill, and we had a cadre of congressmen complaining, we need to do something about the spending, and they passed it. I was just giving you my own perspective. To me, the situation is beyond comprehension. I can't imagine how they're going to get the spending under control. What's your perceptions of this reality? Can this actually be dealt with? What is going to come out of all this, John?
Well, that can has been kicked down the road. Now, I'm a card-carrying member. I carry a sign saying the world is about to end, the debt is about to, cause us a problem. I carried that sign for 25 years. And the supposedly big, beautiful bill, it didn't, it cut some spending. There was some interesting news in there. You are allowed to cut back on some domestic welfare programs like Medicaid. It's not as much of a cut. The whole budget math there is kind of, there's an arcane thing. It was a cut relative to the law that said we're going to raise all the taxes. The taxes are temporary, but everybody knew that that was a fiction anyway. So I view, on the larger question of budget is mostly trundling along. There was some good pro-growth things in there, like some greater expensing of investment. But it was not the great fiscal reform that the US needs. Exactly. We have made promises to our old folks that we cannot keep. And sooner or later, we're going to do something about it. I think that bond markets, hold US debt on the faith that America will once again do the right thing after we've tried everything else. Surely you got a great country. You're not going to throw it down the tubes of a debt crisis because you can't get around to doing the obvious. But the obvious things that need to be done is a fundamental tax reform. Our tax code is a Swiss cheese of exclusions and deductions to which we added some more, like no tax on tips and a little present for Social Security recipients and stuff like that. So it wasn't good or bad. It wasn't unexpected. It just kicked that can down the road. And sooner or later, we got to get around to fixing it. I hope in relatively good times and not, in response to the crisis when we start borrowing money in the bond markets, which is we're starting to see some nervousness. And the 10-year bond yields are kind of creeping up and it's getting harder to sell more and more of them. So, the time to do something about it may come. So I'm not quite as I don't think it's quite as imminent a disaster, but when the next crisis comes, it may be very hard for the US to borrow. We may get another big surge of inflation. It took three surges of inflation to get the US to get its act together in the 1970s, 1980s. It may take another one to get our act together now.
So I want to give our students an opportunity, but I can't resist just asking one more thing. So let's just flip a little bit to another subject I know you talk a lot about, and that's growth. So, we have something in history in the United States called growing over 3% per year. Is there any hope at all that we will see this again in the United States?
Yeah, I think so. So just fill in a little bit of the great question for the people who may not be right up on this stuff. The US was growing very strongly in the post-war era right about through 2000. And then our growth rate cut in about half, the long-run growth rate. Now, the US is doing better than everywhere else, as you saw on the graph. Europe just stopped growing in 2010. And Italy has actually seen negative growth. And there are growth disasters all over the world. Argentina, Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba. Growth can disappear. It's not automatic. So the slowdown in growth I rate as one of the biggest problems. And for other countries, catching up to the US level, why be 40,000 when you can be 60,000 or 80,000? That's the most important thing. I do think it's hopeful because of the level of dysfunction. And a lot of dysfunction means it's fairly easy, it's technologically easy to cure things. As Javier Milei is showing in Argentina. And the basic insight I'll give you is economics teaches us about incentives. And politics is about transfers. Politics is all about taking from A and giving to B, protecting B from competition, making things the way they used to be. It's all about getting in the way of growth. So that means there's a lot of room there to restore the incentives and get growth going again. And before we get into robots and AI and so forth, just the basics of our tax code. You want low marginal rates and a broad base. We've done that before. We did that in the 1980s. Spending. The social programs need to spend money on people who need it while minimizing the disincentives. We reformed those in the 1980s and again in the 1990s. So that sort of thing is possible. Smaller countries seem, even more able to make those kinds of reforms. Israel did it in the 1980s. We just need another round of that. When does it come? When taxpayers demand it? And I'm seeing signs of that in the U.S. The left, interestingly enough, in the US, the abundance movement is coming out of the left in the US. They noticed you can't connect windmills to the grid because it takes 15 years to get the permits. Well, we got to do something about that. Oh, good. Then while you're at it, there's a whole bunch of other permits that could get fixed. So I'm always hopeful, but someday it's possible.
Hello, my name is David Tell. Nice to meet you. A big fan of your blog. Been reading it for years. And now you can see my eyes too and see that I wasn't lying. Though maybe I was, who knows? Yes, I wanted to ask two questions if that's okay. The first one, your theory is very interesting, and I was very happy to hear it. I couldn't help but notice that the time frame did not go that far back. And I have to ask, I mean, is all the stuff we said about Phillips curves for decades, was that just myth and misunderstandings? Does your theory really cover all the movements like back to the 50s and 40s? And the second thing I wanted to ask was, it always surprised me the US never did or never had to issue treasury bills which are adjusted for inflation, like attached to the CPI, which many other countries do. If the market starts demanding that because of current US problems, do you think that will change the US government behavior in the short term? Do you think they'll just take less debt? Do you think it will make them restructure the way they spend, or do you think they'll do nothing and just keep going towards the cliff? So would that make any substantial change if the market demanded that? Thanks.
Thanks. Two great questions. So Phillips curves, there was a Phillips curve in the model that I showed you because, if you want to model how inflation is related to output, you need something like a Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is a mess. The theory behind it's a mess. The empirical work behind it is a mess. So physical theory does not get rid of the Phillips curve. It simply adds on to the Phillips curve. What's the fundamental force? And then the Phillips curve is the dynamics. My current research is all how to fix the Phillips curve. So I do think it's a mess, but it's not. Our central banks treat the Phillips curve as like the central, on its own, the causal mechanism of inflation. Inflation comes from tight labor markets. No, no, no. It's one part of a soup, and it's the part of the soup in why inflation doesn't happen instantly. So I agree it's a mess. I'm working on fixing it. Those of you who want to do academic work should work on fixing it. We're in this wonderful moment where everything is falling apart, needs rebuilding. But that's not instead of fiscal theory. Um, History, yeah, I of course think it fits everything, but the stories are different. Uh, it fits well, for example, why the gold standard fell apart in the 1930s is another great story of fiscal theory. The ends of hyperinflations are a great story for fiscal theory. In some sense, in every war, the inflation that we had in every war is very clearly because we were, borrowing money like crazy and inflating it away. Tom Sargent, if you like economic history, let me recommend Tom Sargent and George Hall have looked at US history from the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the patterns are all really fiscal inflation. CPI-linked bonds, the US does issue CPI-linked bonds. They are unfortunately absurdly complicated. I have a proposal for how to fix them. So they have not been as popular as they should be. They tend to be illiquid and underpriced. But the question you ask is a brilliant question that as people want more inflation protection, which I think a little more inflation, they're going to want more inflation protection. Then when the government promises to pay off CPI-linked debt, it no longer has this trick of if we don't want to pay off the debt, we can just inflate it away. Now, if you don't want to pay off the debt, you become like Greece. You got to default on the debt if you don't want to pay it off, or raise taxes that you don't want to do. So I'm all for CPI-linked debt because it really forces the government to make those decisions and not to just count on inflating away the debt. So we have it. I think we need a lot more of it, and it poses a really interesting question. What inflation is no longer just about should central banks raise or lower interest rates. Inflation is about should treasuries finance themselves with CPI-linked debt or not. And there's good answers on both questions, but let me just celebrate the question is exactly the right one.
I'm Shai Rosenman. I'm a researcher of the Indian subcontinent. One question, if I may, on growth. A question, if I may, on growth. How dependent is U.S. growth on H-1B visas and basically Asian mathematicians? That's basically, I think, the subset. And what are the most important policy reforms that you would make as to elite immigration?
Yeah, so I think U.S. growth depends a lot on immigration and paying off our budget. There's a bunch of people who want to come to the U.S., work hard, start businesses, pay taxes, and pay for my retirement, and we don't let them in. Hello? In fact, there's, some of the stuff I've seen on this, one of the biggest increases in global GDP you can have is by allowing more economic immigration, match smart people with opportunity. The whole American immigration system is such a chaotic mess that obviously letting in more H-1B visas. Put me in charge, wide open. Show up in the US, show you know how to speak English, pass the citizenship test, and forswear government aid for 5 years, and you're in. And H-1B visas would be nice because I like smart people, but I also like people to come and teach school and take care of kids and help old people and clean up and pick vegetables and all the other wonderful things that immigrants do. So economic migrants. Now, there's all sorts of cultural problems. Europe has a big migration problem, and it's really an assimilation problem. You let in uneducated single men alone, and you don't let them work. And goodness gracious, of course, who don't speak your language, of course you've got a problem. So, a sensible immigration policy focused on economic immigration would be a great boon for the U.S. I wish we had an opposition party that had a sensible reform in mind rather than just anybody who
his name is Elon Musk. Elon Musk spoke strongly on that. Yes.
No, I say, even Trump has said. Trump has said anybody who gets a STEM degree, we should staple a green card to it. Yeah, okay, let's put that into action.
Thank you, sir.
And I like Israeli software engineers too, not just Indian ones.
Hi, I'm Ariel. I'm an econ PhD student. You said previously that when the US sneezes, everybody gets a cold. So take, like, I don't know, an economy like Israel, for example, even if policy was completely optimal, I know, budget surpluses and great central bank, etc. If the US, does stupid things, is inflation unavoidable in like a mid-size open economy like Israel because there will be inflation coming from the budget deficits from the US?
No, it's not unavoidable. You have your own currency, and you can have perfectly non-inflationary policies in Israel and let the dollar depreciate relative to the shekel. Now, of course, that's going to cause troubles internally. If the shekel gets really strong and you don't have inflation and we do, your exporters are mad about it and they want a little more inflation to keep up with the US. So it does not inflation doesn't necessarily propagate across countries when you have your own currency. You can let your currency appreciate, but then there's all the genuine economic and political pressures to follow the US that impinge. You actually have as far as I can tell, a very well-run central bank, and you had less inflation than everybody else, so keep at it. But those real, and if the US puts in this huge tariff regime that we seem to want to put in, that's going to cause a small open economy like Israel some trouble too. But stay good at what you're good at and keep your currency strong. The Swiss have had a nice strong currency for a long time. They're kind of the paragon. They're the only country in the world whose problem is that its currency gets too valuable. I would love to have Switzerland's problems.
Us too.
My name is Naftali, and actually a few years ago I watched one of your talks on YouTube, and that's how I became aware of Friedberg, so thank you for this.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and my question is, what part of the government budget are most susceptible to erosion under an inflationary environment, big deficits, stuff like this?
Yes, so inflation helps the government by inflating away the debt. Of course, the US's problem is not really the existing debt. The US's problem is that we've made promises to people in the future that we don't know how to pay for. And unfortunately, most of those are indexed, so that inflation in some countries really helps. Like if you have a lot of government workers and they're paid too much, well, you just inflate a little bit and then you effectively lower the government workers' salaries. But the US, the federal workforce isn't that big. State and local is a little bigger, but most of them are indexed one way or another. The Social Security is explicitly indexed very generously. And healthcare, of course, we pay whatever ridiculous prices they want to charge, so that goes up quickly. So inflation doesn't really help the budget that much. It mostly wipes out the value of some debt. And that's why actually a big inflation wouldn't help the US budget that much, because the Social Security, the promises that we've made to the old folks just go up with the inflation.
So I guess parts that are unindexed, if there is any.
Yeah, there's not that much that's unindexed
Okay.
and not that much that's unindexed for very long.
Okay, thank you.
So speaking of Social Security, John, why has everybody stopped talking about privatizing it and bringing the Chilean model to the United States?
Well, I don't know about everybody, but President Trump decided early on that he was not going to die on the hill of Social Security reform. And so that was the end of that from the Republicans. And goodness knows the Democrats aren't going to go in that direction. They want the government to provide everything. So, there's lots of the rest of us. And of course, the Chileans have backed off. The Chileans show one of the problems of privatizing a Social Security system. One of the problems happened is that some people that start working on the black market and don't contribute, and then they get old and they say, we want money. And so the government, gives them money. And then the government is threatening, at least I forget where they are in Chile, but to seize the assets and then turn it back into to a traditional one. So it's a great idea. I think we kind of know in the US we need some sort of pension reform. There's also the state and local pensions, which are huge and completely underfunded. So lots of promises that nobody knows how to keep. And there's lots of things we're not talking about. Social Security, we're not talking about fundamental tax reform. Even the big beautiful bill, it was the usual fiddling around the edges of deductions and inclusion, but throwing out all of the deductions and exclusions and having a low marginal rate for everyone, that has kind of fallen off the political radar screen for now. But that's about politics. In the world of economics, there's sort of a drumbeat of things that we keep saying are good, like low tariffs are good, privatized Social Security is good, and a simple tax code with a uniform low marginal rate is good, and regulatory sanity is good, and sooner or later some politicians will listen, I hope, or voters will listen and demand politicians pay attention.
Okay, thank you so much, John. It's just always a great privilege and honor to have you speak to us. So again, thanks, and we look forward to having you again.